Hello readers by eyes and by ears, this is Mari Chan and welcome back to my channel. Today we are concluding the reading of Copper Coins Volume 1, also known as Tong Qian Kan Shi by Musu Li, so that is chapters 13 and 14. I hope you all enjoy these last two chapters before moving into Volume 2. So anyway, let's get started, shall we? Chapter 13, Life Exchange Array. Lu Yuan had been a widower. 13 years ago, he'd moved from the Lu family's old home to settle down east of the river. His wife had passed, so he was raising his two sons alone, supporting them with a small fishing boat. Despite a naturally fearsome face, he was an honest, straightforward man. He always smiled at others, which softened the ferocity of his features. His neighbors often said that Lu Yuan's sons didn't look at all like him. Lu Yuan was tall and stalwart, with muscular, powerful arms from his years of hauling in nets. His two sons were a different story. When he'd first arrived east of the river, his eldest son was 4 and his younger son was 2. They were both thin and gangly. Still, while his younger son was skinny, he could see a hint of Lu Yuan within him. He was spirited and full of vigor. Lu Yuan was a big-hearted man, and Lu Nianqi was playful and unruly. He'd often get into trouble, so Lu Yuan had to discipline the mischievous boy frequently. It was the first son who was truly nothing like Lu Yuan. Whenever the three of them were together, the eldest son, nicknamed Lu Shiju, always stood out. He was far too pale, bordering on sickly. His personality was also very different from Lu Yuan's. Lu Shiju barely spoke, and he didn't act like a child at all. Most of the time, he came off as very mature, but he'd occasionally make strange movements. That, combined with his ashen skin and frail appearance, gave him an unsettling air, so people tended to avoid him. The neighbors would tease Lu Nianqi from time to time, but they rarely did the same to Lu Shiju. What the neighbors didn't know was that Lu Shiju was not Lu Yuan's biological son. Lu Yuan had very little family. His old kin had long passed. After his wife had died, he'd fallen into deep depression for a year, and his home suffered for it. For that entire year, his son Lu Nianqi had very little to eat, and he turned gaunt and pitifully skinny. So Lu Yuan decided to lock up their old house and take his son to Wolong County. The riverside was good for fishing, which would provide them with enough to live. Before entering the city, he and his son had rested at an old temple within the mountains. He'd encountered Lu Shiju huddled there. A child of around 3 or 4 hiding alone in an old temple wasn't a normal sight. Lu Yuan asked Lu Shiju a few simple questions, which were enough for him to guess what had happened. Lu Shiju had once lived over 1,000 miles away in Ge County, but with the drought that year and too many mouths to feed, his parents had found themselves unable to support all their children, and they were forced to abandon a few. They'd probably wanted to sell them, but Lu Shiju was sickly and weak, and his vision had been impaired from birth. No one wanted him. Unable to find a buyer, they could only abandon him. If they dropped him too close to home, he might find his way back, so they took him 100 miles away instead. Travelers would rest at temples from time to time. If he were lucky, a kind person might find and adopt him. It was a foolishly optimistic thought. After all, there were far more robbers and wolves in the mountains than kind-hearted souls. The likelihood of being captured or devoured was far greater than the chance of being adopted. But Lu Shiju had been lucky. He'd encountered Lu Yuan. Lu Yuan thought that raising 2 sons wouldn't be that different from raising 1, and now Lu Nianqi could have a playmate, so he decided to bring Lu Shiju home. However, he soon realized that Lu Shiju wasn't a good playmate. The boy preferred to sit quietly instead of running around. Still, he was a sensible child. He would feel his way around despite his poor vision, help Lu Yuan sort through fish and shrimp, or bring a stool to the stove so he could prepare soup. While Lu Yuan was strict with Lu Nianqi, he never touched a hair on Lu Shiju's head. Instead, he doted on him dearly. Children loved playing with those slightly older than them, and Lu Nianqi was no exception. Despite Lu Shiju's reticence, Lu Nianqi would follow him around. Lu Nianqi saw it as helping, but Lu Shiju saw it as a nuisance. For instance, one day, Lu Shiju had boiled a tub of water to help his father wash their clothes and shoes, hoping to remove the reek of fish from them. Lu Nianqi scampered around the kitchen, excited to help, only to slip and land in the boiling water, bottom first. He shrieked like a stuck pig. On another occasion, the tree in the yard had become infested with insect shells, hampering its ability to produce fruit. Lu Shiju took a wooden broom to sweep the shells away, and Lu Nianqi scampered over to help again, only to grow amused by the shells during their cleaning. He picked one up and blew on it like a whistle, and the clear, bright sound delighted him. Alas, by nightfall, his lips had swollen into sausages, causing him to wail again. At first, just the sight of Lu Nianqi gave Lu Shiju a headache, but as his eyesight deteriorated, he could no longer see Lu Nianqi anyway, so he grew used to his little brother. Once Lu Shiju's vision faded nearly to nothing, he began to notice strange things and hear odd sounds. Sometimes, he couldn't resist following the sounds outside, searching for their source. When he found nothing, he quietly returned to his tasks. The year things changed, he was 9, and Lu Nianqi was 7. One day at noon, Lu Shiju heard another strange sound and, unable to help himself, slipped out of the kitchen, feeling his way to the riverbank. Lu Nianqi had matured a little by then due to his older brother's blindness. Occasionally, it occurred to him to look after Lu Shiju. The moment Lu Nianqi saw Lu Shiju leave, he hurried after him, pestering him to come home the entire way. However, it was like Lu Shiju had been bewitched. He didn't seem to hear his younger brother at all. That same afternoon, Lu Shiju glimpsed a dragon's shadow within the river's misty depths. After yelling in astonishment, he slipped and fell right into the water. Lu Nianqi instinctively leaped after him, wanting to pull his blind brother ashore. But, as had so often happened, Lu Nianqi soon discovered that his helping only caused more trouble, and he almost paid for it with his own life. The stretch of river they'd fallen into was secluded, with no fishing boats around. If it hadn't been for a couple selling vegetables passing by, they might have drowned without anyone the wiser. The old man didn't know how to swim, but he recognized Lu Nianqi. By the time Dad arrived, Nianqi had stopped struggling, Lu Shiju recounted slowly. The waters were turbulent. He couldn't rescue both of us together, so Dad first held me up so I could breathe, then he pulled Nianqi ashore. When he returned for me, the wind picked up, bringing waves with it. I felt a vortex foaming beneath my feet. It lashed onto his ankle, and he began thrashing and choking on water. He sucked in a breath, frowned, and exhaled softly. I was shoved ashore, while the vortex dragged him underneath. He never resurfaced. Dad was gone, and Nianqi became terrified of water. He also stopped following me around. As he spoke, he didn't cry or show any strong emotions. His tone was placid, as if he were recounting a stranger's story, and his eyes didn't so much as moisten. For some reason, the listeners grew uncomfortable in his stead, as if they were feeling sorrow in his place. Xuanmin put away the 2 rune-covered shards and spoke up. I noticed a break in Lu Nianqi's palm line corresponding to the age of 6, but someone elongated it by force. Lu Shiju's eyes were on Lu Nianqi. He didn't look up or speak. After a long pause, Lu Shiju said softly, At that time, I didn't really understand. I thought that things would be fine as long as I found a way to connect the lines. Even if it stunted his growth, he'd be alive at least. It'd be enough for him to keep living, no matter what kind of life it would be. But When Lu Shiju had lengthened Lu Nianti's life, Lu Yuan had met with disaster, an equivalent exchange. Having finished his account, Lu Shiju finally met Xuanmin's gaze. The tomb doesn't end here. There's still another section ahead that will take you to the exit. It's not dangerous. Could you do me a favor and take Nianti there? Xuanmin looked at him askance. One final favor. Lu Shiju tensed. He murmured before sighing. Otherwise, I've taken this trip in vain. Xuanmin was about to respond when Xian interjected from the pouch. This hollow is at least 30 feet deep. How are we supposed to climb up and keep going? Without waiting for an answer, he continued. Should I spit the water back out so you can all float to the top? What a great idea. Saves us time and effort. Lu Shiju fell into a shocked silence at Xian's interruption. It was Xuanmin who had to respond. No need to trouble yourself. You were the one who swallowed it all. Take responsibility and live with it. Xian sputtered with fury, but failed to reply. As he spoke, the always quiet old man Liu gently patted Lu Shiju and pointed at something. The others followed his gesture and saw a shadow on the wall of the former pool, about as large as a man. They headed toward it for a better look, eventually realizing that it was a metal door. After being submerged for so long, its lock and hinge had rusted shut. Unfortunately, Xuanmin's talisman had proven useless in this chamber, so they had to use more primitive methods. After a great deal of time and effort, they finally managed to smash open the rusted lock with a piece of rubble. Lu Nianti, who'd been unconscious on the ground the entire time, was jolted awake by the screech of the iron door creaking open. You're up? Lu Shiju looked at him. Can you stand? If so, don't keep lying there. If you want to leave, you'll need to do it on your own 2 feet. No one's going to carry you. Lu Shiju had returned to cold indifference the moment Lu Nianti woke up, showing no desire to mend their brotherly relationship. I know. Lu Nianti had swallowed several mouthfuls of the foul-tasting water. It aggravated his throat, leaving it a little hoarse. In the past, Lu Shiju's lack of caring would have pulled an angry retort from him, but he threw no jabs this time. Instead, he stumbled to his feet and coughed while hitting his chest, expelling the last dregs of liquid from his throat. Jiang Shr-neeng's paper body hung not far from where they stood, drying. It'd been a while, and he was no longer so damp. At least, not enough to fall apart with a single touch. Xuanmin picked him up, tossed him into the pouch with the bloated marble, and joined everyone in leaving through the iron door. Behind the door was a staircase sloping upward. The tomb's craftsmen had probably designed it as an exit they could use after laying down the tiles at the bottom of the pool. The end of the staircase led into another passage, which was an exact match with the hall they'd entered from. It was as Lu Shiju had said. There were no further dangers. The lengthy staircase didn't even have any disturbing murals. It was surprisingly safe. When they'd almost reached the top, Xuanmin's paper blazed to life once more. Right as it flared, the tongue of flame began to emanate an odd smell, which spread around them in faint wisps. Inside the pouch, Jiang Shr-neeng cried, "Oh, wait! Don't move! Something's not right with the smell." What smell? Lu Nianti seemed to recall something after speaking and covered his mouth, afraid that something strange might enter through it. He held his breath. However, thanks to Jiang Shr-neeng's warning, Xian's sharp senses, sharper than Xuanmin's, let alone anyone else's, caught a faint whiff of sticks and leaves. It was the smell of crushed leaves and wood. Not especially pleasant, but not particularly disagreeable either. Still, it was strange to encounter the scent within a dark, sunless tomb. Jiang Shr-neeng came from a family of doctors and had grown up among many herbs and poisons. Though he would have said he was inferior to his parents if asked, he still knew a fair amount. He was also sensitive to the smells of various plants and capable of discerning between them. The fact he'd cried out meant there really was something odd going on. Emboldened by Xian, Jiang Shr-neeng crawled out of the pouch to look at Lu Nianti. "You don't need to cover your nose and mouth." He waved his paper hand reassuringly. You probably won't be familiar with the smell. To be honest, it's not one I know well either, but I saw 2 people lose their lives to it, so it left a deep impression on me. I don't know if you've ever heard of this poison. Its folk name is 7 Climb, 8 Descend, 9 Pass. The name comes from how anyone poisoned by it can only climb 7 steps up a hill or 8 steps down one. In any case, they'll die by the time they've taken 9 steps. Isn't that called Antiar? Xuanmin asked. I've heard of it. Oh, said Jiang Shr-neeng, that's right, you're from the south. The Yupish tree that produces it thrives in the south but can't survive long here. Generally, if you wanted to use it in your medicine, you'd have to wait for summer and autumn to buy some from southern herb dealers. Somehow, Jiang Shr-neeng always circled back to the topic of medicine and herbs no matter what he was talking about. Can you get to the point before New Year's? Xian said coldly. Jiang Shr-neeng's words stuttered to a stop. When he continued, his voice was stiff. Don't touch anything around us. I suspect the walls of this passage, the ground beneath our feet, and even the ceiling above our heads have been coated with the sap of that tree. We're all wounded. A couple of brushes, another couple of steps, and we're all goners. The more he spoke, the quieter his voice became, his confidence waning, because Lu Shiju had turned to look at him with his sightless, pitch-black eyes as he was speaking. Then, Old Man Liu slowly turned his head and fixed his murky eyes on him. Finally, even Xuanmin looked down at him. You... Jiang Shr-neeng mumbled a couple of words before clearing his throat and shrinking back into a corner of Xuanmin's pouch. Don't stare at me. I'll just lie here at the bottom of this bag. You all be careful. Xuanmin swept his gaze over Lu Shiju and Old Man Liu before fixing upon Lu Nianqi. After going through the iron door, the order they'd been walking in had changed. In the beginning, it'd been Lu Shiju and Old Man Liu in front, with Xuanmin behind them and Jiang Shr-neeng and Lu Nianqi trailing him. Positioned in the center, Xuanmin had almost served as a barrier. Things were different now. While Lu Shiju and Old Man Liu were still in front, it was Lu Nianqi who was trailing directly behind them. No longer serving as a central barrier, Xuanmin brought up the rear, guarding their backs. Lu Nianqi lowered the hand covering his mouth and nose. Halfway through Jiang Shr-neeng's explanation, he turned his back to Xuanmin and faced Lu Shiju, staring fixedly at his blind brother. Lu Shiju didn't return the look. After Jiang Shr-neeng's warning, he turned away and continued walking toward the other end of the staircase. The flickering flame between Xuanmin's fingers cast a dim yellow glow in front of him, just wide enough to reach Lu Shiju's feet. Before the youth stretched a vast expanse of darkness, while behind him glowed a warm golden light. With each step, he walked the delicate line between light and shadow. The collar of his garment was torn, and his disheveled hair partially scattered over his pale neck, casting a large shadow. Thanks to the dim lighting, it was difficult to notice anything amiss. Furthermore, Lu Nianqi was far shorter and thinner than most. Being several steps behind Lu Shiju, he was unable to clearly see the area around his collar. As Jiang Shr-neeng had warned, the entire passage was smeared with the poisonous sap of the Yupish tree. The closer they got to the exit, the more pronounced the smell became. "We're here," Lu Shiju said, standing at the top of the highest step, his back to the others. "This is the last section. It leads to the entranceway. I've never gotten to the end, but the exit should be beyond another stone door." "I've never gotten to the end." This statement sounded innocuous, but something seemed amiss on further thought. If he'd gotten this far and seen the stone door, then why hadn't he left? Old Man Liu also stood at the top of the stairs. From Xuanmin's vantage point, he could see the elderly man's half-turned profile. His old eyes focused blankly at a spot in the passage ahead, and he seemed both dazed and lost in thought. Lu Shiju didn't continue walking. Instead, he turned to look at his brother behind him. "What are you staring at me for? You can only see my chi, not my face." Lu Nianqi stopped in his tracks. For some reason, his voice was hoarse and trembling, laced with an undercurrent of sorrow and fear. "Stop looking and just go. What are you standing here for? We can talk outside." I don't want to hear your ramblings now." "I can see your face," Lu Shiju said calmly, "even if it's not clear." He ignored the second half of Lu Nianqi's sentence and lowered his head, then pulled that bundle of twigs from his clothes. The red string binding it was a little faded. It was unclear how long it'd been tied there, yet it bore no signs of wear, a testament to its quality. "This toy, you take it," Lu Shiju said, handing the bundle to Lu Nianqi. Lu Nianqi frowned and stepped aside a little, looking at his own feet instead of Lu Shiju. "I don't want it. Hold it yourself," he snapped. "Why should I have to carry your stuff? Stop talking so much. You're blocking the way. Get going. What are you standing there for?" The corners of Lu Shiju's lips curved into a faint smile. "I'm not going." In the long years the two brothers had supported each other, this was one of the few times that Lu Shiju had ever smiled. Unfortunately, Lu Nianqi didn't see it. He kept his head down, frowning, refusing to look at Lu Shiju until he sighed heavily. "What do you mean you're not going? Don't talk crazy." By the time Lu Nianqi raised his gaze again, his eyes were watering. He shoved Lu Shiju hard. "Why don't you just go?" The firelight in Xuanmin's hand perfectly lit Lu Shiju's face, revealing the subtle transformations taking place on his ash-pale skin. Faint marks began to emerge on his forehead, scattered right between his brows, resembling new moles poised to sprout. They mirrored the ones originally on Lu Nianqi's forehead. "But I can touch you. Why aren't you moving?" Lu Nianqi struggled to suppress the lump in his throat. He repeated the sentence twice, as if trying to convince himself. "Look, I can grab your hand. There's no difference between you and ordinary people. Didn't they say you can't touch ghosts?" Stubbornly, fixing his eyes on Lu Shiju, Lu Nianqi suddenly realized that his sight was blurring. He couldn't see his older brother clearly anymore. Sniffling, Lu Nianqi reached up to rub his eyes, and his hand came away wet. When he raised his head, he still couldn't see. "Stop rubbing your eyes." Lu Shiju sighed softly and shoved the bundle of sticks into Lu Nianqi's hands. Then he grabbed his younger brother and slowly dragged him up the steps. The more Lu Shiju told Lu Nianqi not to rub his eyes, the harder the latter did, until he pulled away and stood there with his hands over them, completely refusing to move. Off to the side, Old Man Liu hobbled a few steps forward and bent down by a wall. He returned to the steps a moment later and handed the things he was carrying to Lu Nianqi. "This is Uncle Liu's money pouch," Lu Shiju said. "The boat fare he collected some time back is here, along with the herb seeds he collected from Auntie Liu. It'll help with her headaches." When Lu Shiju finished speaking for Old Man Liu, he went quiet. There was a long silence. "I don't have anything else to give you," Lu Shiju said at last. He placed his hand on Lu Nianqi's head. "I'm going to find Dad now. Don't forget to burn some paper for us during Tomb Sweeping Day and the Ghost Festival. Burning them will guarantee your joy and longevity, as well as plentiful descendants." With that, he gently patted his brother thrice, then withdrew his hand. Lu Nianqi felt coolness dispersing from the top of his head, and his heart instantly chilled. He wiped away his tears and looked up, only to find everything still blurry. As he tried to make out what he was seeing through that veil of fog, he realized that Lu Shiju and Old Man Liu had disappeared. He wiped at his eyes again before spotting a dark shadow 20 yards away. Xuanmin went over and shone the light, revealing 2 figures collapsed next to the wall of the passage. The smell of sap tree was even stronger here. The closer he drew, the more potent it was. He saw the bloodstains smeared on the wall and understood. Lu Shiju and Old Man Liu had wounds on their backs and necks that had allowed the toxic fluid to seep in when they leaned against the wall. As Lu Shiju had fallen, he'd drawn a circle surrounded by complex runes in his own blood on the ground. It was a chilling sight, and most bizarre were the numerous copper coins scattered around the array. Despite their disordered appearance, They'd actually been placed in accordance with the stars and constellations overhead. Xuanmin guessed the sequence of events. The 4 strings of coins that Lu Nianqi had shouted about losing had been swiped by the deceased Lu Shiju himself using condensed spiritual energy. After all, the objects needed for a life exchange were very specific. Despite standing there beside Xuanmin, Lu Nianqi was unable to see any of this. His mind and vision were prepossessed with the sight of Lu Shiju lying there. The ground was too cold, so he wanted to help Lu Shiju off of it. Inadvertently, when Lu Nianqi stepped forward, he walked into the circle. Xuanmin watched as the circle of dried brown blood turned vibrant again. The spot between Lu Nianqi's brow and the cut on his palm both shone with a bloody glow. But before anyone could blink, the light was gone. A wisp of mist escaped from the mouth of Lu Shiju's icy, long, rigid body. It circled around Lu Nianqi 3 times, as if some kind of ritual had been completed at last, then bowed in Xuanmin's direction. With that, this final favor was complete. If not for the Lu family, both father and son, Lu Shiju probably would have died in that temple 13 years ago. Now, he'd swapped his life for a life. To him, it was well worth it. His wish had been fulfilled. It was just too bad that, from now on, he'd have to burden Lu Nianqi with placing another lantern on the river during the Ghost Festival. As he faded, he wondered if his younger brother would cry. Chapter 14. The Skeletons on the Riverbed. The mist inside the passage dissipated. The moment the life swap completed, a chill enveloped everyone. Perhaps the reversal of yin and yang caused by exchanging a life for a life had stirred the 300 souls within the tomb. A sudden wind bellowed from behind them, followed swiftly by an urgent rustling. At the same time, the sounds of stone statues crumbling and colliding swept over them. Xuanmin clapped his hand on Lu Nianqi's shoulder. He was about to say, "Let's go," when something lunged toward them. It brought with it a gust of air carrying the indescribably foul and stifling stench of decay. The corpses might have struggled to walk while alive, but after being trapped in the tomb for so many years, they were suddenly as swift as the wind. Before anyone could move, a dense mass of people burst onto the stairs. A handful of them might have been manageable, but there were dozens, no, hundreds of yin corpses surging like the tide. There was little anyone could do to stop them, even if they had 8 hands. The passage became unbearably claustrophobic. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Xuanmin grabbed the string of copper coins at his waist, but then grimaced, reluctance in his expression. Was he unwilling to use them, or would it be inconvenient somehow? Maybe he couldn't use them. As more and more corpses gathered, they packed the passage like stinking salted fish, surrounding everyone within. The besiegement slowly compacted as the corpses crouched and braced themselves. Then, in a relentless black wave, they lunged again toward Xuanmin. "Bald donkey!" The rocking of Xuanmin's pouch was making Xueshan's head spin. He could sense the stench of rot fanning around them, though mixed within decay's metallic smell was a faint medicinal aroma. At that second, something in Xuanmin's hip quivered before radiating intense heat, one far more searing than the heat that had boiled Xueshan earlier. Perhaps it was the temperature, or maybe it was something else, but Xueshan's heart thumped once and dropped. The smell of blood grew stronger. This was bad, bad, bad. How were they supposed to make it out alive? Of course, Xueshan was only a golden marble and couldn't die. Besides, he was a dragon, and their lifespans were practically endless. He'd eventually find a way to safety. The question was actually complete nonsense when applied to him and the long-dead Jiang Shr-neeng. There were only 2 people here who needed to stay alive, Lu Nianqi and Xuanmin. The first was none of his business, while the other... Well, they happened to have gone through a series of events together. That was all. Xueshan didn't understand why he felt so anxious. His anxiety persisted anyway. So after racking his brain, he had Jiang Shr-neeng give the marble a shove, which gave ShooANNE the momentum needed to leap out of the pouch. The residual warmth from Xuanmin's hip still suffused ShooANNE, leaving him with a nameless sensation. It might be that the thing he'd absorbed had finally been digested. The golden marble fell to the ground with a clatter, and ShooANNE looked up. Half of Xuanmin's snow-white robe was stained with blood. The flames between his fingers swayed violently, like a beast struggling to free itself from its chains. The yin corpses teemed around him in a solid formation as they attacked with either gnashing teeth or clawing fingers, which ShooANNE couldn't say. Through it all, Xuanmin's expression remained as cold and indifferent as ever, as if it wasn't just others that he didn't care about, but himself as well. ShooANNE didn't know if Xuanmin had heard him land, but the flame within the monk's fingers did twitch a little. The golden marble rolled away, speeding madly like a headless chicken, but it also seemed to be planning something. After darting through the tangle of the corpse's legs, ShooANNE's marble slammed hard into the stone wall of the passage. Boom! The entire tomb trembled as if struck by a gargantuan weight. Wait, was that me? ShooANNE was dumbfounded. While it wasn't impossible for the marble to have that much power, ShooANNE had been weaving all over the ground. By the time he crashed into the wall, he hadn't much momentum left. He'd originally planned to strike it several times, shaking it loose little by little. If he used his full strength, he could blow 10 of these tombs to smithereens. But if it wasn't his doing, whose was it? ShooANNE didn't dwell on it and crashed into the wall twice more. Boom! The stone tomb shook again. Debris rained down from the ceiling, cloaking ShooANNE in dust. He didn't have a mouth at the moment, but he sputtered a few times anyway before he rolled back and turned to Xuanmin. Other than him, the only one capable of doing this to the tomb was that bald donkey. Sure enough, through the mass of razor-sharp claws, ShooANNE saw Xuanmin using his bloodied finger to trace around the edge of his coins, soaking them with blood. Perhaps it was ShooANNE's imagination due to the dim lighting, but Xuanmin's 5 coins, usually so dull, seemed to shine with a faint oily sheen, as if they'd been polished by the blood. Suddenly, Xuanmin pressed his thumb down on one of the coins, and crimson blood gushed out, bathing the copper surface once more. Boom! The whole hallway shook as if caught in an earthquake. The tremor sent ShooANNE spinning all over, until he was on the verge of spewing the water inside his marble. As if he was performing a prayer of sorts, Xuanmin placed one hand on the copper coins while the other held the flame to his chest. Splatters of blood flew around him. His eyelids lowered, and his lips moved soundlessly. A deafening explosion echoed through the tomb. Debris flew and dust swirled, the ground groaning as it neared collapse. Then, icy water poured in through the cracks in the rubble, submerging them all. The new water was freezing, but it felt nothing like the stagnant water from the cave's pool. Instead, it possessed a crisp, invigorating chill, reminiscent of the first breath of the north wind during winter. It was genuine river water. ShooANNE fell into the water, thinking with a strange calmness, "That bald donkey stole my plan. He really blew up the tomb." However, before he could finish his lament, he realized that Xuanmin's explosion had not only destroyed the tomb, it had blown apart the entirety of Funto Island. Rubble mixed with mud and trees rained down upon them, along with a massive army of yin corpses, forming a mighty avalanche. ShooANNE was watching this in stunned silence when he felt river water surge beneath him. It seemed the tomb's collapse and the destruction of the flow of 100 soldiers' array had sent the river into turmoil, summoning another massive maelstrom. There were now countless eddies around him, all being drawn in one direction. The group found themselves tossed about by the maelstrom along with the shattered rubble and yin corpses, and eventually they lost all sense of orientation. In his intense dizziness, ShooANNE felt a surge of rage. Whatever had been absorbed in the golden marble really had been digested, and now it stirred. A wrath flashed through him. The heat he'd absorbed from Xuanmin's hip rampaged through the marble until his entire body throbbed with pain, like the liquid in a blister yearning to burst from the confines of his flesh. In an instant, dark clouds gathered in the sky, and a blinding light slashed downward. Answering thunder rumbled like a stampede of horses, rolling from the heavens and pounding into the river below. Torrential rains followed, churning up a mist that shrouded the entire river, making it impossible to see anything within. Moments later, a faint, clear whistle echoed from the riverbed, and a massive shadow flickered within the dense mist. With a sweep of its body, the whirlpool pulled down toward the riverbed, dragging with it countless yin corpses and debris. The currents twisted like water dragons as they dove into the muddy depths below. If 6 feet of earth were enough to bury one person, then what about 60 fathoms of river mud? Could that lay those 300 souls to rest? By the riverside, a child who hadn't rushed to shelter from the rain peered over the courtyard hall, a plum branch in hand. He stared blankly at the distant river and sky. As his parents came dashing over to grab him, he turned to them. "Dragon!" he cried. The couple turned to look without thinking and glimpsed a long shadow flickering within the haze. It rode over the clouds and thunder, then leaped into the vast river entirely. Heavens! It really is a dragon! The dragon had climbed into the clouds, but the heavy mist and thunderstorm meant only a scant few had sighted it. With time, it would probably fade into legend, just like the name of Wolong County itself. In reality, the great legend ShooANNE hadn't been as untrammeled as that family of 3 perceived. While he had indeed ascended with the clouds and thunder, that was in his dragon's nature. In the exhilaration of regaining his true form, he couldn't help expressing his joy. However, once he broke through the clouds, his paraplegia reared its head again. He could only move his upper body. His lower half, instead of aiding him while turning, became a long, cumbersome burden. Full of despair, he plummeted right back into the water. ShooANNE had been disconnected from its true form for over half a year. During that time, it had passed through several unfamiliar hands before being buried beneath Scribe Liu's accursed residence. Who knew how much filthy mud and how many wandering ghosts it had consumed? As ShooANNE's spirit returned to his body, it was like putting on a new skin. He'd need time to reacquaint himself with it. In a moment of excitement, he'd overexerted himself, and when he fell back into the river, his explosive might from earlier dissipated. His spirit was struggling to control his body. He wanted to curl up to protect himself from the fall, but his attempts were unsuccessful. Sinking down to the river's depths, he could only resign himself to his fate. Meanwhile, Xuanmin had begun to float upward when the whirlpool dissipated. Just as he caught his first glimpse of sunlight, that plummeting dragon collided with him. The half-conscious Xuanmin was slammed into the riverbed by ShooANNE's long tail, crushing all air from his chest. With that, he was out like a light. ShooANNE blew a bubble from his snout. "There are always certain things we find ourselves powerless against. How about you lose your memory again?" Fortunately, the only person he'd crushed was Xuanmin. Lu Nianqi had escaped unscathed, as well as the bodies of Lu Shiju and Old Man Liu, and they now floated to the river's surface. The clamorous thunderstorm summoned by ShooANNE's return dissipated as swiftly as it had come. As the rainstorm ceased, someone soon discovered the bodies floating on the river and had a nasty shock. The corpse collector responsible for this stretch of water rowed his creaking boat to the river's center. He'd spent his entire life fishing up corpses, but he'd never encountered anything like this. The sheer number of bodies floating on the misty surface of the river was absurd. Some of them had been submerged for who knew how long. their clothes tattered, while others looked like they'd just drowned. The corpse collector counted on his fingers, 9 in total. The 3 fresh bodies floated close together. They were probably victims of the same drowning incident. The remaining 6 were somewhat scattered. Perhaps it was his imagination, but from his vantage point, one of those 6 bodies seemed to be looking toward an islet in the middle of the river. Many smaller islets were scattered around Funto Island. They mostly served as resting spots for waterfowl and were easy to overlook. However, for some reason, they seemed almost like strangers now. Something was definitely off about them. The corpse collector tugged the corpses over with his pole while musing on what it could be. A moment later, he realized. What happened to Funto Island? The corpse collector was an old hand. He worked briskly. In the blink of an eye, he'd pulled 2 of the fresher bodies onto his boat. When he flipped the bodies over, he found himself shocked again. Old Man Liu, the boatman, was his acquaintance, and he'd watched Lu Shiju grow up. How awful! He sighed, then reached with his pole to pull up the 3rd body. It was the small, skinny Lu Nianqi. He couldn't help but sigh again. Old Lu's family is no more. However, after pulling Lu Nianqi onto the boat, the corpse collector gasped. Why does Xiao Nianqi look a bit different? I saw him just a few days ago. Lu Nianqi often went out. It was his job to gather firewood and cook, so the corpse collector saw him around regularly. Everyone in the area who was even slightly acquainted with the Lu family knew Lu Nianqi's real age. They'd heard that after he'd lost his father and almost drowned, he'd burned with a high fever for days that damaged his body. Ever since then, his growth had been stunted. At first glance, he looked like a young child, though a precocious one. The corpse collector wasn't a tall man, and in his memory, Lu Nianqi had barely reached his chest. Looking at the boy lying on the deck now, the collector roughly measured him with his arm. He seemed taller than before. How can someone grow taller in just a few days? The corpse collector wondered aloud, then quickly provided himself with an explanation. The boy might have been bloated from sinking in the river. Just as the corpse collector withdrew his hand and was getting ready to fish out the bodies farther away, Lu Nianqi, who was lying lifeless on the boat, shot straight up. Lu Nianqi coughed several times, then spat out a mouthful of river water. His face flushed crimson from the force of it. Blearily, he opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was the startled corpse collector falling into the river with a splash. ShooANNE, lying on the riverbed, was roused by a loud splash on the water's surface. He stared blankly for a long time before regaining sensation in his body, along with some control. He tried to turn his head, but as he did, he spotted a large stone lock lying several feet away. The lock was enormous, half the size of a coffin. It had a square bottom that seemed particularly heavy, and a pointed top with a hole through which a thin iron chain had been threaded. The chain was pulled taut like it was attached to something above. Looking up, ShooANNE found that the other end of the chain was tied to something resembling tattered cotton fluff with Black River plants attached to it, fluttering in the water. No, it was neither of those things. Lu Nianqi had seen something on their way to Funto Island, a black mass beneath the boat that resembled hair. He'd taken it for river plants because, if it had been hair, the corpse should have been floating on the water surface, not submerged underwater. ShooANNE took in the stone lock and the iron chain again. Now, he understood why this person hadn't floated to the surface. They were tethered by ankle, forcing them to stand upright in the water. He swung his head, churning the river water, and a broken chain nearby was pulled closer by the current. Judging from the break, he'd probably snapped it during the storm he'd raised earlier. Thinking silently, ShooANNE waited for his body to recover. Once enough agility and control had returned to his upper half, he raised his front claw and tugged on the iron chain. And he missed. Exasperated, he stared down at his own claw. He'd grown used to reaching out at will in his human form and had forgotten that a dragon's claws were comparably shorter. In any case, his first attempt had failed because the chain was out of reach. It's a good thing my travel companions are either unconscious or missing, Xian thought privately. How humiliating would it be if they'd seen that, especially that annoying bald donkey. He raised his dragon head and moved along the soft mud of the riverbed, unwittingly dragging his lower half over Xuanmin's chest as he passed by. The unconscious Xuanmin twitched his fingers. Xuexian's sharp claws scraped against the iron chain. Like a knife meeting tofu, the sturdy iron chain was sliced clean in two. The lower half of the chain slowly sank into the riverbed, while the body it was tethered to began to drift toward the surface. It's a little tiring, Xuexian thought with a click of his tongue. He was still unused to his dragon form. Even raising his upper body to break a chain was exhausting, akin to scaling an intricate pagoda while carrying 1,000-pound weight, leaving his arms weak. He slumped back to the riverbed, his large dragon head resting listlessly on the soft mud. Adopting the least taxing posture he could manage, he watched the stone lock bound with iron chains. After scanning the area for a while, he deigned to use his stubby front claw to flip the stone lock over. The bottom of the lock was exposed, revealing a circular mark carved into a corner of its flat surface. During his time mingling with humans, he'd heard that many craftsmen like to leave a mark on their creations. They'd leave a large one if possible, making it akin to a signboard. Otherwise, they'd leave a small mark in some inconspicuous corner, as subtly as possible, making the mark invisible unless one knew where to look. No one would be bored enough to tie up corpses for fun, so there must be some purpose behind it. His intuition told him that these standing corpses were related to that sinister design of the array within the tomb, but everything inside Funto Island had been blasted to smithereens by Xuanmin. There probably weren't any clues left. He tapped his claws on the muddy ground in deliberation before he decided he might as well be a busybody. With a swift sweep of his body, he summoned a current to push the stone lock toward the riverbank. The tumultuous current surged with great force. Xian rode its momentum, his body coiled around Xuanmin to bring them both to the shore. To him, the broad river spanned no more than the turn of his head or the flick of his tail. Quick as lightning, he'd reached the bank with both the lock and Xuanmin. With the twist of his upper body, he sent a large wave pouring downward, and the stone lock and Xuanmin were pushed onto the muddy bank. Xuexian tossed his head again. White waves engulfed him as he transformed back into his human form. Shit, no clothes. Before anyone could see, he had instantly turned back into a dragon. When he'd painted the paper doll, he'd made sure to include clothes. Now that he'd returned to his true body, that wasn't the case. Awkward. He pulled his lips back from his teeth in a dragon's grimace and plopped down. With a listless sigh, he sank back to the riverbed, wishing he could bury himself. Moments later, a small black worm, which was really a dragon no more than a few inches long, drifted to the riverbank on the crest of a wave. It looked up at the sky and released a long but silent sigh, then slithered over to Xuanmin without a word before slipping into his sleeve and coiling around his wrist like a delicate bracelet. The moment that cool, smooth sensation brushed his skin, Xuanmin opened his eyes. A dragon's body was covered in scales. The ones along its back were the toughest, akin to armor. The closer the scales were to the head, the larger they were. And the reverse was true for the ones near the tail. If you plucked a scale from a dragon, its edge would rival even the sharpest of blades. However, the scales on its belly were quite a bit softer. Earlier, at Guiyuan Hall, Xuexian had gifted Xuanmin with a scale from his belly. Xuexian was proud by nature and believed that most people were irredeemable fools who couldn't be trusted with anything. He feared that if he left Xuanmin a scale from his back, that bald donkey might try consuming it without grinding it up first. If he did that, the scale's edges would slice his mouth right open, and he'd drop dead in the room. That would be quite the scene. In any case, this tiny dragon had a much softer belly. To Xuexian's annoyance, after shrinking himself down, all his scales had become soft and tender. Even the hardest scales of his back had lost their edge. All his scales had left was a slight suppleness, and it was even more pronounced on his belly. Xuexian lowered his head and poked at himself with his claws. How ridiculous! His scales gave out at the slightest prod, no different from the skin of an ordinary human. They might have been even softer than that. The worst part was that he felt no pain in his abdomen either. He was poking himself with a dragon's claw, which could cut iron like butter, but he felt no pain. Clearly, his claws had softened terribly as well. It was a heavy blow to his dignity. With the scales on his body so soft and tender, Xuexian felt a little vulnerable as he sat coiled around Xuanmin's wrist. Xuanmin's hands were quite lovely to look at, slender and strong. However, as a place to curl over, Xuexian found the one he was on quite uncomfortable. Xuanmin's wrist bone dug into his belly, and he felt as if he were lying over the rounded bowl of a ladle. It wasn't painful, but it didn't feel good either, and it was extremely annoying. Xuexian scratched at that wrist bone with a claw, but to no avail. He didn't draw even a hint of blood. Instead, it felt more like he was scratching an itch for the monk. Instantly incensed, he turned his head away and refused to move another inch. This evil spirit had a flair for the dramatic, as well as an awful temper. His talent for driving himself into fits of pique was absurd. However, his constant shifting around was useful for catching Xuanmin's attention. Xuanmin blinked, his expression blank as he stared at the darkened sky with unfathomable pitch-black irises. There was a hint of emptiness within them. Then his lips turned downward, because he detected a faint whiff of blood mingling with the damp air from the river water. When he'd fallen into the water, his eyes had been closed, and he'd recited his incantations silently to avoid swallowing any water. Nonetheless, he'd been trapped on the riverbed for too long, and now his chest prickled with a dull pain. He quietly coughed twice and propped himself up. Without thinking, he surveyed his surroundings. He was on the soft mud by a riverbank, beside a heavy stone block that had sunk a few inches into the earth. There was no one around him, so there was no immediate danger. The river's surface was shrouded in mist, and the fishing boats were gathered in a distant spot, busy with their own business. No one was paying attention to where he was. Satisfied, he looked away. Xuanmin couldn't stand dirt and filth. When he observed his surroundings, a faint look of disgust emerged on his face. As he was getting up to clean off the blood and mud, he felt something on his wrist moving. Frowning, he brushed aside his sleeve and came face to face with the thing coiled around his wrist. Xuexian peered up at Xuanmin. Due to the dragon's discomfort, his entire being exuded a slothful disinterest, and he was loath to engage someone so irritating. The moment he saw Xuanmin's expression, Xuexian couldn't help rolling his eyes. Here we go again. He made a noise of impatience, then stretched out his words as he spoke. Shut up. Don't ask who I am, and don't ask who you are either. Just listen to me. Touch the left side of my neck. Xuanmin was a mistrustful man. If someone else had spoken to him in this way, he'd tie them up first and ask questions later. However, this thing wrapped around his wrist sounded far too self-assured, like there was no way it was speaking nonsense. Moreover, based on appearances, he could crush this thing without blinking. It wouldn't be able to harm him anyway. In the end, Xuanmin coldly stared at it for a moment before complying. He raised his hand to examine the left side of his neck. Xuexian shook his claws, directing him as if he were his servant. Is your hand too short or something? Move it a little higher. Yes, right there. Touch that spot. Don't talk to me before you wake up. I'm not in the mood to entertain your nonsense. The incident with the chain and his short claws had left him frustrated, so he was taking any opportunity he could to mock Xuanmin. Truly, ShooANNE was an unreasonable evil spirit. He watched as Xuanmin touch the spider-like mole on the side of his neck. Just like the last time, the blood vessels surrounding the mole gradually retracted. The process of the blood withdrawing must have been an unpleasant one. Xuanmin's brows knitted, and he closed his eyes, sitting still for a moment before reopening them. The trace of wariness in his gaze faded away, replaced by a neutral countenance, though with a hint of exasperated bafflement in his gaze. Seeing that, ShooANNE knew Xuanmin's episode was over, and that he'd remembered everything. Dropping his head, ShooANNE returned to his flippant attitude, still coiled around Xuanmin's wrist. Constantly forgetting everything. How did you end up like this? Isn't it annoying having to do this routine before you remember? Xuanmin didn't answer. He'd been disoriented earlier and hadn't quite examined his new living accessory. Doing so now, he discovered that the evil spirit had sprouted a head and a tail, and even a full set of whiskers and claws. From the shape of its head, it looked like a dragon, but he'd never seen such a tiny dragon. Ignoring the tender scales, its lower half appeared lifeless. The slender, swaying tail seemed unable to move, as it didn't coil around his wrist like the upper half did. Instead, it hung limply. Xuanmin stared at it for a moment, then reached out to pinch that dangling tail. Under his fingertips, it felt thin and pointed, with a peculiar texture. ShooANNE shot him a sideways glare and snorted. "Unhand me! What are you doing? Did you feed your sense of propriety to the dogs? Which book taught you it was okay to grab someone's tail like that?" It was true his lower half lacked sensation and wouldn't feel pain even if pinched. But pain and discomfort were one thing, and dignity another. Here he was, a proper dragon, being made fun of by someone. It was disgraceful. If not for the fact that he had to rely on this monk for transportation, he would have tossed this clueless fool into the South Sea with a single swipe of his claw. Of course, Xuanmin wasn't a playful person. In fact, he had no idea what fun was. He was just surprised that the evil spirit had so quickly undergone such a drastic transformation. "Where did you swipe this body from?" he asked, though he didn't sound concerned. "What do you mean, swipe?" ShooANNE stared at him. "You think I would tolerate using someone else's body?" At this, Xuanmin felt inside his pouch, only to find the marble was gone. "This is your true form?" he asked. His tone was flat, as if he were simply summarizing something. ShooANNE's snort was his answer. Since you've gotten your body back, why are you coiled around my wrist?" Not that he intended to let ShooANNE go. After all, the paper he was carrying clearly stated, "Find them," and the notes on it were related to ShooANNE. He couldn't let this evil spirit leave so easily. Well, that was what Xuanmin intended. That ShooANNE would linger made zero sense. After all, he'd tried to run away several times. He was quite the repeat offender, and a tireless troublemaker. Why hadn't he fled while Xuanmin was unconscious? Instead, ShooANNE had docilely coiled around his wrist, waiting for him to wake up. That was completely unexpected. Xuanmin raised his head and poked at the dragon's tiny head, trying to check if the evil spirit had eaten something disagreeable, or if he'd run into some kind of trouble, and that was why he was acting so out of character. Xian swatted at Xuanmin's fingers, shoving the nuisance away. "You're the one who wanted to capture me, but now you're trying to chase me off? Want me completely at your beck and call? Isn't that unreasonable? I'm not leaving, so deal with it. And stop poking me. Get lost." Xuanmin had nothing to say to that, scolding him while coiled around his wrist. ShooANNE was beyond shameless. In reality, ShooANNE didn't have an upset stomach, nor had he lost his mind. Xuanmin's suspicions weren't unfounded either. ShooANNE really had considered running. Being naked was a minor issue since he could easily find someone by the river to borrow clothes from. If that didn't work, he could strip the bald donkey while he lay unconscious. At worst, he'd look like a man in mourning. It wasn't a bad trade. No, he'd chosen to stick to Xuanmin because of the benefits ShooANNE had sampled while inside the marble. There was something unique about Xuanmin's body, a mysterious quality that had hastened ShooANNE's return to his own form. Perhaps Xuanmin could also aid the dragon in regrowing his missing bones and tendons more quickly. ShooANNE considered himself quite callous. He'd stay if there were benefits and leave if there were none. It was that simple. He didn't have time to sort out his more detailed reasons. In any case, he wasn't inclined to leave at the moment and planned on following this monk for a while longer. At worst, he'd just leave Xuanmin an extra gift or two when they parted ways. Besides, having Xuanmin around made certain matters easier to investigate. He was much more useful than that bookworm Jiang Shr-neeng. He dodged Xuanmin's hand again, raising his dragon scales and baring his claws, so the bald donkey knew not to touch him. Xuanmin's eyes, however, remained fixed on the stone lock. To ShooANNE, the object he'd absorbed back in the river was a seed. Even when curled up quietly, he could feel it stirring within him. Somehow, though it was inside him, he couldn't figure out what it was. If it was part of his body, why had it appeared on Wolong County's Funto Island? Could the person who'd stripped his tendons be the one who'd set up the feng shui array on Funto Island? If not, there was probably still a significant connection there. If Xuanmin could illuminate the markings on the stone lock and untangle where it'd come from, ShooANNE could perhaps use the answers to track down the person who'd maimed him. Under ShooANNE's urging, Xuanmin cleaned himself of mud and blood and walked to the rocky riverbank. At the same time, Lunianti came stumbling over, pale as a ghost. Xuanmin noticed the fishing boats and passenger vessels that had gathered near them. They'd probably spotted Lunianti and the others, but that didn't explain why quite so many people had shown up. Lunianti staggered as he felt his way over to them, then squinted in their direction for a long time before speaking. "It's really you." His voice was heavy with exhaustion, probably due to the truth of Lu Shiju's death. He'd yet to recover from the shock. After catching a breath, he added, "Could you help me with something? Right now, I don't know what's wrong with my eyes, but I don't feel too well. Shiju is right in front of me, yet I can't see him. I can see the outlines of others, but I can't see him at all." With a flick of Xuanmin's fingers, the remaining water on his robe vanished. He released the freshly dried Jiang Shr-neeng from his pouch before striding after Lunianti, heading toward the gathering of boats on the riverbank. ShooANNE remained coiled around Xuanmin's wrist, his tail protruding like a dangling worm from Xuanmin's sleeve as it swayed back and forth. Squirming beneath the fabric, ShooANNE eventually peeked out, his dragon head only half a finger wide as he cocked his head and peered at Lunianti. Despite his frail and gangly appearance, Lunianti had far more vigor than Lu Shiju because he was often on the move. Coupled with his stubborn temperament, he exuded a sense of toughness. In essence, he was a hard-headed little rascal. However, at present, every step he took appeared arduous. Each movement was light and tremulous, as if he couldn't stand touching the ground, and applying any force to his limbs was unbearable. From the strain on his face, it was clear he was enduring immense pain. After only 10 steps, he was as white as paper. The river water dappling his forehead had just dried, but now a sheen of cold sweat hung in its place. "You said you felt unwell. What's wrong?" ShooANNE saw Lunianti's terrible complexion and, suspecting that it wasn't only due to grief, had to ask. After all, his lips were pallid and bloodless, like a patient on death's door, burning with fever. As his face grew wider, his eyes seemed darker, pitch black and devoid of light, as if they didn't belong to a living person. "It's nothing," Lunianti said. His eyelashes fluttered, and he licked his dry, cracked lips before shaking his head. "I don't quite understand it. It's just... there's a dull ache in my bones, and when my feet touch the ground, I hurt from head to toe. I'm afraid to put too much pressure on anything." His answer was soft and low. Before ShooANNE could reply, Lunianti continued quietly, "I'll just deal with it. It'll pass. It can't be worse than being dead." Jiang Shr-neeng cast him a sidelong glance. "That might not be the case." Suddenly, Lu Nianqi turned to Jiang Shr-neeng. "You're no longer alive, right?" Lu Nianqi blurted out. He might have been much older than he looked, but he was still a child. His words held nothing back. In that moment, even Xuan, who couldn't see much peeking from Xuanmin's sleeve, felt that Lu Nianqi's eyes brightened, as if he'd caught hold of a lifeline. Jiang Shr-neeng had a gentle temper. Though he would throw Xuan the occasional retort, he'd never treat a child that way. He paused in his surprise, then nodded. I've been dead for 3 years, but I haven't fulfilled my last wish, so I'm staying in this paper doll." At that, Lu Nianqi could barely walk straight anymore. He made a misstep, and a sharp pain seared through his foot. As he cried out, another wave of cold sweat dripped from his face. However, he completely ignored it to stare at Jiang Shr-neeng. "Really? That means, even if he's dead, he might not have disappeared?" Lu Nianqi asked. Jiang Shr-neeng looked at Xuanmin, then back to Lu Nianqi. "Living souls will usually linger for a while," he mumbled. "In certain situations, they might stay longer. Right, Master?" Xuanmin glanced at them, but he didn't answer. Instead, he pointed ahead, indicating that they'd arrived. A number of boatmen and fishermen had gathered. The presence of so many people made discussing the supernatural inconvenient. Lu Nianqi took Xuanmin's silence as agreement, and some color returned to his face. In front of them, 7 or 8 boats, all tied near the shore, jostled against each other. The people on the boats disembarked, and a few worked together to drag something off a larger boat. "Heavens! When did they fall into the water?" One of them clicked his tongue. "They're all rotten. I've been fishing corpses from this river for a great many years, and this is the first time I've seen anything like this." That was the corpse collector's voice. When Lu Nianqi had come back to life on his boat, the corpse collector had stopped his retrieval to bring the 3 back to the riverbank. He carefully laid Lu Shiju and Old Man Liu to the stones, then helped Lu Nianqi onto the bank and gave him a cup of hot wine to warm himself up with. After that, he rowed back out to retrieve the remaining corpses. After hearing the corpse collector's report, all the fishermen and boatmen on the riverside came rushing over to help. As they still needed to carry their fish and passengers, placing dead bodies on their boats would be inauspicious. So they instead helped the corpse collector drag the waterlogged corpses, little better than lumps of tattered cotton, onto the shore and arranged them in a row. It made for a macabre sight. Xuanmin frowned at the row of corpses. "I just got a big scare." The corpse collector had reached the bank, and he moved the last body ashore while he continued. "I counted 6 floating corpses to begin with, all near a small islet. But when I went to retrieve the last 2, another one came floating up. It surfaced right next to my boat. That feeling, it was too much." Xuan discreetly scratched Xuanmin with his claw and muttered beneath his clothes. "Keep an eye on those corpses. The last corpse the collector talked about should be the one I sent to the surface. They're definitely connected to that horrible array. I'll explain it later. For now, just pay attention and see if there's anything strange about them." His voice was muffled within the fabric and difficult to catch clearly, but Xuanmin managed to understand most of it, as if the dragon's voice had reached his ears through the gaps within his robes. Xuanmin turned his face aside, grunting in acknowledgement. Then he flicked Xuan's tail using a finger concealed within his sleeve, indicating the dragon should settle down. Rather than do that, Xuan chomped on his finger. "Let go," said Xuanmin flatly. Jiang Shr-neeng and Lu Nianqi both started. Let go of what?" Xuanmin's expression was still as stone as he gazed at the waterlogged corpses that had been dragged ashore. His eyes swept over them, from the exposed bones of their ankles to their disheveled tangles of hair. Compared to the others on the shore who were covering their noses and retching, he seemed almost ethereal in his demeanor. Perhaps that was too intimidating, for after Jiang Shr-neeng failed to extract an answer, he dared not ask again. He took it for a case of tinnitus and turned his head away. Xuan's teeth were still clamped around Xuanmin's finger, biting fiercely at him for flicking his tail. It was a long time before his anger abated enough to let go. In the meantime, it turned out that Xuexian's guess had been quite accurate. Though there was nothing particularly odd about those 7 corpses, they all had something hanging from their waists. While the fishermen and boatmen were busy vomiting and catching their breaths, Xuanmin stealthily used a piece of white hemp to remove the dangling objects. When he was done, he placed 7 iron military tags in a row, all inscribed with names that had been scratched out. This proved that these people, together with the ones in the tomb, were part of the same group. Xuexian watched as Xuanmin wrapped the tags in white hemp again and put them away. "By the way," Xuexian said, "some of the iron tags buried in the riverbed are still there, just not all of them. We can take a closer look later." Xuanmin walked up to Lu Shiju's corpse as Xuexian spoke. Lu Nianqi was by his brother's side, his hand raised, like he wanted to reach out to him, but was too afraid. As if the moment he did, Lu Shiju would truly be gone forever. "Look." Lu Nianqi raised his head, and his eyes fell on Xuanmin. His gaze seemed oddly vacant, increasingly resembling that of a blind person. "I can feel him here. I can touch him, but I can't see him. I can see you and the people on the shore. It's not very clear, and I cannot make out their faces, but I can see them. I can't see Shiju at all." Xuanmin glanced at Lu Shiju, who lay on the river stone, his eyes closed. Then he stared at Lu Nianqi's dark eyes for a moment and said, "You're not seeing through your eyes. Your vision has already faded. You just haven't realized." "What do you mean?" Lu Nianqi's throat tightened. Peeking out from under Xuanmin's sleeve, Xuexian stared at Lu Nianqi's eyes. "Oh, that makes sense," Xuexian said. "I was wondering why your eyes lost their light while you were submerged." After a moment's thought, he said to Lu Nianqi, "Lu Shiju exchanged his life for yours, so his divination skills were also transferred to you. The abnormalities you're feeling must be related. They haven't fully manifested yet, so you'll have to survive a bit of pain." Lu Nianqi was stunned for a moment. "You mean, you're saying my eyes will become like Shiju's?" "Not will. They're most likely already there," Xuexian said. "What you're seeing is no longer the physical form, but qi. You're seeing what Lu Shiju did every day." "Then the reason I can't see Shiju is because—" Lu Nianqi's nostrils flared as if he was unable to catch his breath, and when it did come, it was hurried but stuttering. He frowned and his eyes grew strained and red. "Because of what?" Xuanmin raised his hand and pressed his thumb against the acupoint between Lu Nianqi's brows. "You've developed a red mole here. Your brother had one that looked the same. This mark signifies that the life exchange was successful. If his soul still lingered in the world, the mole wouldn't have emerged." Life swapping was a forbidden technique. Even when it succeeded, the survivor of the exchange would usually become abnormal. This was because they'd always inherit something from the one who sacrificed their life, whether appearance, personality, or ability. The lines between the two souls blurred. The longer the soul of the sacrificed lingered, the stronger their impact would be on the survivor. In other words, in order to minimize the effects on Lu Nianqi, Lu Shiju hadn't lingered for even a second. The indifferent words he'd said to Lu Nianqi in the tomb were his genuine final farewell. They'd never meet again. Don't cry." Jiang Shr-neeng couldn't find a handkerchief, so he used his fingers to daub the silent tears rolling from Lu Nianqi's eyes. Perhaps—" Before he could finish, Lu Nianqi had already passed out, his face devoid of color. It might have been from the unbearable agony in his body or from the shock from the news. In any case, Lu Nianqi would be unconscious for quite a long time. No matter how cold Xuanmin was, or how much of a bastard Xuexian was, they weren't about to stroll off and leave behind a dead youth and an unconscious boy. That would be absolutely asinine. For now, they decided to stay in the small home the boys lived in. It was a shabby place. There was an area for cooking and a small drab hall. The latter only had space enough for a square table, with 2 wings on either side. Each of those held only a single narrow bed and a wooden cabinet, which must have belonged to the 2 brothers. Though they were staying, In truth, the only person who was occupying the place was the unconscious Lu Nianqi. Xuanmin placed him in one of the rooms, then went to the nearby funeral parlor to order a coffin. After he laid Lu Shiju in the coffin, Xuanmin put it in the other room. Just as Xuanmin sat down in the hall, planning to carefully think over the stone lock and iron tags, Xuexian's head poked out from his sleeve. "Don't sit down yet. Go find a tailor. A fabric store will do." Xuanmin looked down at him, waiting for his explanation. Xuexian scratched at his own head with a claw. Then, with the most authoritative tone he could muster, he said, "I'm not wearing any clothes." Xuanmin's eyes roved over the small dragon's body. A second later, he coolly tossed Xuexian's previous words back at him. "Which book taught you that it was okay to coil naked around someone's wrist?" Xuexian bit Xuanmin again. His dragon's teeth were razor sharp, and each bite left a crescent-shaped mark. Xuanmin's expression remained neutral as he brushed aside his sleeve, revealing his slender, bony fingers. He curled his index and middle fingers and presented them to Xuexian. On those fingers were at least 6 bite marks, all thanks to this creature. Xuexian turned his head away, pretending not to understand. "Stop showing off your hands. They're no better than chicken feet. Way too bony. Practically useless decorations." You weren't saying that earlier. Coiling around them feels uncomfortable as hell. Please, just start moving and get me some clothes. Jiang Shr-neeng entered the room in time to hear Xuexian's tantrum. Unable to bear watching, he immediately retreated into a sunless corner of the kitchen. Xuanmin shook his head and stood to leave. In the beginning, his trip was just to buy Xuexian some clothes, but what would happen while he was out would prove more complicated and lead to quite a few unforeseen developments. Alrighty, everyone. That concludes the reading of Copper Coins, also known as Tong Qian Kan Shi, Volume 1 by Musu Li. So the next time we convene in regards to this series, it will be in Volume 2, which is already out. So I hope you guys are ready to continue that story. Now that I've gone through my recovery period, or at least I'm speaking this in advance, so it's December 30th now, but by the time you've heard this, I should be out of my recovery period. Maybe not. But anyway, the second volume is going to go back to being released at a slower rate. I'm not exactly sure what rate that is going to be yet, as the third volume releases on April 21st. So I want to try to drag out the second volume just a little bit more, so that way it doesn't feel like there's as much of a pause, even though technically you're pausing in between chapters depending on the days that I release. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this first volume. Please let me know your thoughts and reactions in the comment section, and 我爱你们.